A man climbs a hillside above the Sea of Galilee, and behind him the water lies flat and bright like a sheet of hammered metal. Below him a crowd is forming. They did not come for a lecture. They came because a blind man in this district can suddenly see, because a leper walked back into his own house and his own family did not run, because a man who spent years screaming in a graveyard is now sitting quietly, dressed in his right mind. They came for the next miracle. They came for bread, and the carpenter does not give them any of it. He sits down. That gesture was not fatigue. In the 1st century, a rabbi who stood up was offering an opinion. A rabbi who sat down was issuing a verdict. It was the posture of a king on a throne and a judge on a bench. When this carpenter lowered himself onto that rock, every Jewish person within earshot understood the message before he said a word. He was not about to share his thoughts. He was about to lay down law. What follows over the next 3 chapters is the most quoted speech in human history. We call it the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus never called it that. A North African bishop named Augustine gave it that title more than 3 centuries later. And in the 1600 years since, it has become the most misread text on earth. Here is why. You have never actually read this sermon. Neither have I. What you read is a translation. English is a beautiful language, but it is a poor container for a Galilean rabbi speaking to men who lived in a world of salt merchants, Roman occupation, and Aramaic street slang. Somewhere between his mouth and your page, 9 words got flattened, 9 Greek words, 9 locked doors, and most English Bibles hand you a photograph of the door instead of the key. This is not a story about ancient grammar. This is not a story about a dead language. This is not a story about footnotes in the back of a study Bible. This is a story about 9 words that together form a portrait of what a human being actually looks like when God moves inside them. And I have to warn you about the last one now, at the beginning, because it will be waiting for you at the end. There is a single word in the closing minutes of this sermon that is more terrifying than every syllable Jesus ever spoke about fire. It is not a word about punishment. It is a word about intimacy. That is what makes it unbearable. We will get to it. Not yet. Start at the top of the hill. Before the first word, watch where the sermon is aimed. Matthew writes that Jesus saw the crowds, went up on the mountain, sat down, and then his disciples came to him. Read that sequence again. He sees the masses, and he climbs away from them. He does not project. He does not shout down the slope. He waits, and the men who have already committed to him walk up. That detail unlocks everything. This is not an appeal to a hostile world. This is not a program for cleaning yourself up, so heaven will accept your application. This sermon does not tell you how to get in. It tells you what people look like once they are already in. It is not a ladder. It is a family resemblance. Now the first word. Jesus opens with a rapid series of sayings we call the Beatitudes, and he uses the same Greek adjective 8 times. The word is Makarios. Your Bible almost certainly renders it blessed. That translation has gone soft. Over the centuries, blessed drifted toward lucky, toward fortunate, toward happy. And happiness is a hostage. Happiness is chained to happenings. Good week, good mood. Bad diagnosis, bad life. Makarios is not that. Not remotely. In classical Greek literature, Makarios was the word reserved for the gods on Mount Olympus. It described beings who lived above the reach of famine, plague, war, and grief. Untouchable, serene not because nothing bad was happening in the world below, but because nothing bad in the world below could get in. So when Jesus says Makarios, he is not saying cheer up. He is saying here is a life the world cannot reach. And then he tells you who has it. Blessed are the poor in spirit. The Greek word for poor here is not the word for a man who is short on cash. It is the word for a beggar crouched in the dust with his hand out and his face down. The culture around you says, build your brand, project strength. Never let them see you sweat. Jesus says the kingdom belongs to the people who have stopped pretending. They have anything to offer. Blessed are those who mourn. Not disappointment, not a bad day. This is the word for grief at a graveside, applied to something most people never grieve at all. The rot in your own chest and the wreckage outside your window. Here is what most people miss. Every one of these describes a condition you would never put on a resume, and Jesus calls it untouchable. Then comes the third word, and it detonates in the middle of a specific man's chest. Blessed are the meek. We hear meek and picture a man who apologizes for existing. A doormat, a coward with a soft handshake. The Greek word is praus, and in the ancient world it had almost nothing to do with weakness. It was a hoarse word. It described a war stallion that had been broken, trained, and made fit for battle. Understand what that means. The stallion still has every ounce of muscle it had in the wild. The same speed, the same terrifying power. Nothing has been removed. One thing has been added. It now answers to the bridle of a rider. Meekness is not the absence of power. It is power that has finally found an owner. Now put a name on that hillside. Sitting somewhere in that circle is a man Luke calls Simon the Zealot. The Zealots were a nationalist movement that believed Roman occupation was a blasphemy to be answered with steel. Some of them carried short, curved daggers under their cloaks in crowded markets. Simon has spent his adult life believing the kingdom arrives when enough Romans stop breathing. And the rabbi looks at him and says the earth goes to the broken war horse. Jesus is not telling Simon to become harmless. He is telling him that all that fire in his gut is real. It is useful, and it has been pointed at the wrong target by the wrong hand. Stay with me because the next word carries a warning. Jesus turns from what a kingdom citizen is to what a kingdom citizen does. You are the salt of the earth, he says. Notice the grammar. He does not say try to become salt. He does not say read enough and you might qualify as light. He states it as a fact that already exists. In a world with no refrigeration, salt was not a seasoning. It was the only thing standing between meat and rot. The difference between a family eating in winter and a family starving in winter. And the way you applied it was not delicate. You rubbed it in, hard, into every fiber, which tells you what Jesus thinks of the world. It is not neutral. It is flesh that has already died and is quietly going bad, and the people of the kingdom are meant to be pressed into it. Then the warning. Jesus asks what happens if the salt loses its taste, and the verb he chooses is moreno. It does not mean to go stale. It means to become foolish, dull, stupid. It is the root behind the English word moron. And here is the part nobody tells you. Pure sodium chloride cannot lose its saltiness. Chemically, it is impossible, but the salt sold in ancient Judea was scraped from the shores of the Dead Sea, and it came mixed with gypsum and mineral powder. When the actual salt leached out, you were left holding a white crystalline substance that looked exactly like salt, poured like salt, sat in the jar like salt, and preserved absolutely nothing. A counterfeit is never obvious. That is what makes it a counterfeit, which brings the disciples to the question forming behind their eyes. If this kingdom is so completely upside down, is he throwing out Moses? He shuts it down immediately. He did not come to abolish the law. He came to Pleroo it. That word does not mean to obey a rule. It means to fill something all the way to the top, to bring a thing to the destination it was always headed toward. The law was never a fence. It was an arrow, and he is the place it was pointing. And then he drops the sentence that empties the air out of the hillside. Unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. You have to hear that the way they heard it. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing a generation later, describes the Pharisees as the sect regarded as the most accurate interpreters of the law in the entire nation. These men fasted twice a week. They memorized enormous tracts of scripture. They tithed the herbs in their kitchen gardens, counting out mint and dill and cumin leaf by leaf. Some walked with their eyes fixed on the ground, so they would not accidentally see something impure. Telling a first-century farmer he had to out-righteous a Pharisee was like telling a man who jogs on weekends he has to beat an Olympic sprinter or die. Somewhere in Jerusalem, a Pharisee named Nicodemus will hear about this line, and it will bother him enough that he walks across the city in the dark to ask this carpenter a question he cannot ask in daylight. So how do you exceed the righteousness of a Pharisee? You do not. That is the point, and this is where the whole sermon turns. The Pharisees regulated hands. Jesus regulates hearts. Their system measured behavior at the surface, and as long as nothing crossed the line where other people could see it, you were clean. Jesus traces murder back to contempt and adultery back to the private theater behind your eyes, and he does it with a formula that would have stopped conversation cold. You have heard that it was said, But I say to you, he does not cite a single rabbi. He speaks as the man who wrote the law in the first place. He did not raise the bar. He moved the target. Religion manages the outside. The kingdom rebuilds the inside. If that just reframed something you have been carrying for years, take 1 second and subscribe. And do me a favor in the comments. Tell me which of these words you were taught wrong. Blessed Meek Salt, somebody in that comment section needs to read your answer more than they need to read mine. Now the sermon turns from what you are to what you are performing. In the 6th chapter, Jesus has finished dismantling the illusion of moral perfection, and he goes after the theater. He does it with a word that has spent 2,000 years in our vocabulary, without anybody checking its birth certificate. Hypocrite. To us, a hypocrite is someone whose words and life do not match. In the 1st century Greek world, Hypokrites was not a moral term at all. It was a job title, and it belonged to the stage. A Hypokrites was an actor, a man who held a large painted mask in front of his face and recited lines written by somebody else so a paying audience would feel something. Jesus looks at the most religious culture on earth and says, "You have turned the worship of the living God into a production." He gives 3 examples, and they are not random. Giving, praying, and fasting were the 3 pillars of Jewish devotion. He does not attack any of the 3. He attacks the audience. He is not asking what, he is asking why, and he describes the production. When the religious elite gave to the poor, a trumpet sounded in the street. When they prayed, they chose the busiest intersection in the city and timed the hour of prayer to the hour of foot traffic. When they fasted, they smeared their faces with ash so everyone would know how much they were suffering for God. And then Jesus says the most chilling sentence in the chapter. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. The word underneath received is Apecho. Now watch this. In the late 1800s, archaeologists began digging through the rubbish mounds of an Egyptian town called Oxyrhynchus, and they pulled out tens of thousands of scraps of ordinary paperwork, tax records, grain invoices, rent receipts, and stamped across them, again and again, was this word, Apecho. It was a commercial term, and it meant one thing: paid in full, transaction closed, nothing further is owed. Sitting on that hillside, writing this down, is the one man who knows that word better than anyone present. Matthew was a tax collector. He wrote Apecho for a living. He stamped it on the receipts of farmers and fishermen who had just handed over everything they had. So when Jesus says the performers have received their reward, he is speaking Matthew's professional language. You wanted applause, and applause arrived. Enjoy it. The receipt is printed. The account is settled. There is no second payment coming from heaven, because you already collected in full at the door. Instead, he says, give so quietly that your own left hand does not know what the right one did. Pray in the Tamaeon, which is not a chapel or a prayer room. The Tamaeon was the windowless storage closet at the back of a 1st century house, where you kept grain and tools. The least impressive room in the building. Wash your face when you fast. Let nobody guess your stomach is empty, because a citizen of the kingdom performs for exactly 1 set of eyes. If your faith stops working when nobody is watching, it was never faith. It was a career. And then Jesus names the rival. He shifts to money, but he does not talk about budgets. He talks about allegiance. Do not store up treasure on earth where moths eat it, and rust eats it, and thieves take it. Then the line that explains your entire emotional life. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Not where your heart is, your treasure follows. The other direction, whatever you have decided, is your ultimate security, works on your heart like a magnet. It sets your calendar. It sets your mood at 2 in the morning. It decides what you are afraid of. Then he draws the line nobody can straddle. No one can serve 2 masters. You cannot serve God and mammon. Mammon is not a Greek word. It is Aramaic, and Jesus is code-switching into the street language of his own people. In the ancient Near East, Mamonas did not simply mean cash. It carried the weight of a personified power, an entity that made claims on you. Jesus frames it as a rival god, and the verb he uses for serve is the verb for slavery. Not employment, ownership. Sooner or later 2 owners give conflicting orders, and on that day you find out which one holds the deed. There is a man in that inner circle carrying the group's money bag right now. His name is Judas Iscariot. He will hear this sermon. He will watch the miracles. He will cast out demons in this rabbi's name. And in 3 years, he will sell the rabbi for a fixed price in silver, because mammon does not need you to hate God. It only needs to be holding the bag. Hold that thought, because the last word in this chapter connects money to the thing that keeps you awake. Therefore, Jesus says, do not be anxious about your life. The Greek word is merimnao, and it does not mean worry in our thin modern sense. It comes from a root meaning to divide, to pull into pieces. Merimnao is a mind being drawn in opposing directions at once until it tears. We treat anxiety as a chemistry problem or a scheduling problem. Jesus treats it here as a trust problem. He points at birds that plant nothing and store nothing and still eat. He points at wildflowers that bloom for a day before somebody throws them in an oven as fuel. And he says Solomon in his full royal wardrobe never looked like that. Then the question underneath it all, if your father dresses grass that dies by Thursday, what do you imagine he intends to do about you? Anxiety in this frame is the quiet belief that God is either not good enough to care or not strong enough to deliver. It is living like an orphan inside a house where you have already been adopted. Now the sermon reaches the 7th chapter, and Jesus stops describing and starts demanding. He begins with the most weaponized sentence in modern culture. Judge not that you be not judged. Today it usually means you have no standing to call anything wrong. But a few verses later, Jesus tells the same men to identify false prophets by their fruit, which is impossible without judgment. He is not banning discernment. He is banning the posture of a man behind a bench with a gavel and a rap sheet of his own. And he makes the point with comedy. Why do you look at the Karphos in your brother's eye and miss the dokos in your own? Karphos is a fleck of sawdust. Dokos is the load-bearing timber that holds up the roof of a house. Picture a man with a roof beam jutting out of his eye socket, knocking over furniture, taking out a wall on the way past, then leaning close to a friend and whispering, "Hold still, you have got something in your eye." Notice what Jesus does not say. He never says, leave the splinter alone. The splinter is real, and it still blinds. What changed is your qualification. You do not get to perform eye surgery on another human being until you have dragged the beam out of your own skull first. And then the sermon narrows. Enter by the narrow gate. The Greek for narrow is stenos, a constricted space with no room to maneuver. The road is described with a form of the verb libo, which means to press, to compress, to crush. It is the word for squeezing grapes. The wide gate needs no explanation, because you were born standing in front of it. It is the default. It costs nothing. You can carry your pride through it. You can carry your money through it. You can carry the roof beam through it, and nobody will stop you. The narrow gate takes none of that. You go through stripped, or you do not go through. The earliest surviving church manual we have, a document called the Didache written within a generation of the apostles, opens its first line this way. There are 2 ways, one of life and one of death, and great is the difference between the two. Before the church had cathedrals or councils or a finished New Testament, it had this: 2 roads, and now we arrive at the word I promised you at the beginning. What Jesus says next is the most frightening thing in the Bible, and it is frightening precisely because of who it is aimed at. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. On that day many will say to me, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name? Look hard at those people. They are not atheists. They are not pagans. They are not skeptics who never gave faith a fair hearing. They have correct theology and the right vocabulary. They call him Lord twice, which in Hebrew idiom is the language of deep reverence. And they have supernatural results on their record. Prophecy, deliverance, power. By every measurement our culture uses, these are the successful ones. The platforms, the books, the packed rooms, and Jesus says 4 words to them. I never knew you. The verb is Ginosko. Ginosko is not the word for knowing a fact. It is not the word for recognizing a face or having information about a person. Ginosko is knowing by experience, by nearness, by shared life over time. It is the kind of knowing that only happens in a room with the door closed. He does not say, I knew you once and you drifted. He does not say your works were insufficient. He says we were never introduced. You used my name to build something, and the something you built was yours. Here is why that lands harder in this century than in any before it. You live in the first era in human history, where it is possible to be recognized by 100,000 people and known by none of them, where a person can be quoted, followed, and admired at scale while the interior of their life goes completely unvisited. Psychologists have a name for the private cost of that gap. They call it imposter syndrome, and its core experience is a specific dread that arrives at 3 in the morning, when the applause has stopped, and the room is dark, and you are alone with the distance between what people believe about you and what is true. Multiply that dread by eternity, and you have the 7th chapter of Matthew. This is not a warning about people who failed. This is not a warning about people who doubted. This is not a warning about people who fell short and knew it. This is a warning about people who succeeded publicly in his name and were never once in the room with him. And then Jesus ends the greatest sermon ever preached without an altar call. He ends it with weather. 2 men build houses. One digs down to rock. One builds on sand. And the rain comes, and the rivers rise, and the wind hits. And one house stands, and one house comes apart completely. Read that carefully. The storm is not the punishment. The storm hits both houses identically. Being a citizen of this kingdom buys you no exemption from the rain, the diagnosis, the phone call, the funeral. What it buys you is what is underneath you when it arrives. And here is the thing you cannot manufacture. You cannot white-knuckle your way into loving an enemy. You cannot self-discipline your way into a pure interior. Every one of these 9 words describes something that has to be done to you before it can be done by you. So here is what to carry out of this. First, this sermon was never a ladder. It is a portrait. Every word Jesus chose, from Makarios to Ginosko, describes a life he intends to produce inside a person, not a standard he expects a person to produce for him. Read it as a mirror, and it will crush you. Read it as a photograph of your family, and it will change you. Second, every one of these words points inward. Not one of them can be verified by an audience. Poor in spirit cannot be photographed. The Tamaean has no windows. Meekness looks the same as timidity from the outside, which means the entire kingdom is measured in the one place no one can see and no one can fake. And third, the most terrifying sentence Jesus ever spoke was not about fire. It was 4 words spoken to religious professionals with real power and real results. And it was, "I never knew you," which means the thing he actually wants is not your performance, and not your platform, and not your track record. He wants the room with the door closed. He wants to be known. You do not live this way to become his. You live this way because you already are, and the king has finally moved in. Tell me in the comments which of these 9 words hit you hardest, and which one you were taught wrong. If this opens something up, subscribe so it reaches the next person. Share it with someone who needs it. And pray for us. God bless you. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. This channel is a piece of my heart, and your support is what keeps the fire burning. If you found any value in this video, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It's more than just a click to me. It's a sign that we're growing this community together. Having you on this journey is the greatest gift I could ask for. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.